So just to introduce myself, my name is Jasmine. I am a network organizer here with Power Network. I've been here in this role for a little under a year. And I came up with this idea and, was really reflecting on the current moment and what people seem to be really needing. And when we have so much misinformation and disinformation and campaigns that are based in such heavy propaganda, I thought it would be a useful tool, maybe even a refresher for folks who've been doing this work for a long time, or just anyone in general who wants to remain critical in the way that they consume news media. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. And just a reminder, Jasmine, if you want to go ahead and put your pronouns in your name title. Hey, folks, my name is Saren Glenn, and I'm the Political Education and Trainings Coordinator here at the PowerShift Network. I've been on staff for a little over 2 years, going on my third year now. And I'm really excited to talk about and to share with you all the different ways that you can kind of build your politic and understand misinformation, propaganda, and the ways that the state uses tools and media to benefit their own narratives. I'm currently located in Western Massachusetts, and I'm really excited for us to get started today, Jasmine.
Awesome. So I'm going to share a presentation slide. Cool. So the way things are going to work today is that we have a agenda. I will be facilitating the first half of our conversation, and then Sarah will pick it up in the second half. So we're opening right now. We're going to talk a little bit about our objectives for today, and then we're going to dive into the big question of what is propaganda, talk a bit about who uses it and how, and then we move into talking about critically consuming news media, because that's everyone's goal here. We recognize that there's often not a single right answer in many world events, but rather it's important to just be critical and form our own opinions and have a strong politic and be able to recognize propaganda as we see it. And through our conversation today, we'll also take a critical look at who we get our news media from, and then Sarah will lead us through a conversation on how to find grassroots news sources that better fit our needs. Then we'll close. We'll have room for questions if anybody has them. And then final reminder, this will be recorded and posted, so feel free to come in and out as you need and catch whatever you may miss through the recording. So our objectives today, I'm gonna quickly run through these. So first, we want to understand how US media depictions of world news are deeply distorted and biased by imperialism and Western power. We want to recognize how propaganda and censorship work to prevent solidarity and left political education. And finally, we want to know how to locate more ethical grassroots news coverage of world events. So this was initially a network-only internal training, also led by Sarah and I. So today's webinar, we're still getting across these same exact objectives with a little bit of tweaking to our presentation, but we're still hoping everybody walks away today with these key understandings. So first, we're going to ask this question. This is for anybody watching, anybody tuning in. Feel free, if you're here, to engage in the chat. And I'd like to pose it to you, Sarah. What comes to mind when you think of the terms propaganda and censorship?
I'm giving myself a moment to think, because I want to give a good answer. I'm curious to see what folks think in the chat, if anyone says anything. And then secondly, I think what comes to mind for me when I think about the term propaganda and censorship, I think about, very stereotypical anti-communist propaganda during the Cold War. I think about, seeing it could be anti-communist during the Cold War, or it could be communist propaganda for Russia. If you ever go on Pinterest or you're looking things up or you're reading anything in regards to the political history behind the Cold War, you'll see that communist Russia had a lot of different graphics that were very traditional in their sense of showing the working class and kind of perpetuating a sense of that communism is going to save the day, this type of propaganda and the benefit of the Russian state. And then if you look over towards the West, you see American anti-communism propaganda. I mean, this one's so deeply rooted in our very fiber of our being. And as Americans, unfortunately, and you can see that they would often say how, communism leads to insert an extremity, right? And there wouldn't be a sense of nuance. There would more so just be these ideas that whatever media or news outlet or source that they're utilizing is there to perpetuate and benefit the state of which it's being held within. And when I think about censorship, it's funny how I'm using a lot of foreign and not necessarily US based examples, right? I'm doing that for a reason, folks. But I know as an American, we're often taught about China's censorship and how if you go, online, the Chinese government has a lot of things censored, from adult entertainment to certain news to even just like particular people's performances. There was an example on TikTok just the other day of someone claiming that China was censoring um, a female music artist. I want to say it was either Lizzo or Cardi B at a like recent musical festival or something. And so those are the main things that come to mind when I think about examples. But as far as the terms, I think they can be used either internationally or domestically. They're tools of the state and of the establishment, and they can be used by anyone who decides to use them.
Awesome, Sarah. Those are some great examples, and also really similar to what comes to mind for me. The first one that comes to mind for me, I had to look up her name because I knew she had a name. It wasn't just the poster, Rosie the Riveter. So the war poster with the red bandana and the blue muscle shirt during the war, where they were trying to increase American morale, and that, versus some of the more staunch anti-communist propaganda, was more so just the role of that propaganda was simply getting people on board. Us here at PowerShift know that there's a long history of student anti-war activism and anti-war activism even within folks in the military who choose to dissent and choose to say, let's not buy into the project or the idea that this is necessary. That's been happening for a long time, but on the side of the government and the side of the military, their propaganda looks like pro-war. So it looked like getting people encouraged to buy into the cause, buy into the narrative that the United States necessarily needs to be doing, or that it's ever a necessary thing to be doing. So yeah, those are some great examples. I love that you flagged already where our mind tends to go for some folks, especially folks growing up in the United States. We tend to think about foreign examples of these as if these are not things that the United States also employs, and as if it's things that all of us don't, employ or deploy or use or read or take in from different perspectives all the time. So definitely, we're going to talk about this more later, but definitely don't want to pretend that it's specifically only done by state government propaganda. So again, because we all are gonna, immediately think about all types of propaganda, and we're all, depending on our experiences, going to have different things that come to mind. It is important to have a definition. So this one dictionary definition from Merriam-Webster says that propaganda is the spreading of ideas, information, or rumor for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. Or even more broadly, ideas, facts, or allegations spread deliberately to further one's cause or to damage an opposing cause. So we can see that this is not a necessarily negative definition. There is not an innate negative connotation for the word propaganda. And in reality, folks deployed for a number of reasons. Ideas, facts, or allegations. That's pretty much any idea you could have or any thought that someone could have that they deploy to try to influence folks' thinking and the narrative that's told about them. So it's always just really important to start from this place of, propaganda is a neutral term, so that, we can remember that it's crucial when consuming media to use our critical thinking skills, to employ fact checking, to look behind just the news source we initially come across, and rhetorical analysis. So to recognize where propaganda and bias are popping up and make decisions about that. So again, we keep saying that everyone uses propaganda. So we're going to go through a couple of examples. So this first one here is actually from the movie adaptation of the book Animal Farm. So I personally didn't read Animal Farm in school the way most folks did, but mostly what I understand from the synopsis is it a story about farm animals inciting an uprising on the farm, for more equal rights. And while the book's ending might not have landed down so harsh on the side of the thinly veiled communist farm animals of the story, the movie adaptation, the CIA actually bought rights to, so that they could change the ending of the movie to where the rest of the farm animals overthrew those who were initially, representing the communists. So it's a really interesting tool that the government, admitted to. It's very clearly stated that the purpose was to instill dissent within nations that were at the time communism was rising, and to stop the spread of those ideas, or to at least propel this American Hollywood film with this very subtle messaging. So that's just really interesting example. Hollywood's connections with the U.S. government run very, very deep. Lots of folks by now know about the long-seated relationship between the U.S. Military and Marvel movies, for example, and how many of those scripts have to be passed through a government office so that they can approve the accuracy of the depiction of the U.S. Military and positive reflection. This is literally, you can look it up on the government website. This isn't, us using propaganda. We are using propaganda back in some ways, but just highlighting the ways that these relationships are a little bit more subtle. Everyone's not necessarily aware of it when you buy the tickets to the latest Marvel movie, but we're all being sold an idea about the military. So these are just an example in popular culture. So it's not just war posters. It's not just these kind of historical examples we tend to think of when it comes to propaganda, but it happens at all times. So again, most of us here are in the climate space. So the other example we have here is about example of greenwashing. So for folks who didn't know, BP, the oil company, is largely responsible for this initial mid-2010s flux of the concept of carbon footprint. So from 2004 to 2006, BP introduced a $100 million campaign to introduce this idea of carbon footprinting, again, long before it became a buzzword. So according to the PR folks on the campaign, they were trying to turn the blame for environmental harm to routine human activities and away from any early, folks who would raise the alarm that oil companies were to blame. So this, again, we also, not to, negate or have, put out any necessary opinions here around work to reduce carbon footprinting or to reduce human impact, and we all have decisions to make about individual versus systemic change. But it is really interesting to take in where we learn this thing from. So while we, focus on individual actions such as carbon footprinting, we see that that idea itself came from an oil company trying to deflect attention from a much larger issue. So again, propaganda shows up in different ways. Greenwashing is the term for environmental propaganda. So it's just another way that it shows up in our work. And it's really useful to be able to identify it. Greenwashing shows up in so many ways, from brands just, using thinly veiled language around sustainable practices with nothing to back it up. We see this all the time in, greenwashing packaging, when in reality, there's nothing, more green about plastic. Nothing more can get green about plastic. So just other ways to identify the way that propaganda pops up in our lives. But again, we don't want to only show propaganda from one end of the spectrum. We also need to remember that, revolutionary organizations such as the Black Panthers thought that propaganda was a key part of their movement. So this is an old Black Panther newspaper that used to run out of the West Coast, using propaganda, this kind of political cartoon, to tell folks that this is not our fight to be fighting. This is anti-Vietnam War propaganda. So at the same time that the United States government itself, and from that perspective, is pushing pro-war propaganda, there are organizations on the ground who've always said, this is not the way. Let's influence our people to recognize when this is not a fight for us to be fighting, and this is the U.S. government sending our bodies out on the line. So again, all over the range, everyone uses it. The importance here is how do we think critically and recognize what this is trying to tell us and take in that message. So now we're speeding through things, but I just hope folks, are getting a strong understanding of the fact that propaganda is all over the spectrum. So a couple more examples. Here we go. On the left is another anti-communist, political cartoon. The United Nations condemned the criminal communist invasion of the Republic of Korea. So the UN is this powerful hand coming to stop communist aggression from overpowering the Republic of Korea. Again, everyone can have their own, political analysis of this, but you have to come from this perspective or recognition of opinion. The one in the middle is also another anti-communist propaganda piece, America's Mortal Enemy, showing someone with the hammer and sickle tattoo, dividing up the United States as if that's a goal of communism, for example. And on the right, we see a post 9/11 political campaign that was trying to influence the perspective of Muslims in America, particularly in the face of a lot of the anti-Muslim backlash post 9/11. But again, this is another government campaign with its own motives. So this is just a wide range of examples we've seen here about the ways that propaganda can be deployed, so that we can see that it's, political cartoons, it's in the news articles we read, it's in the ads that we receive, it's deployed by the government, it's deployed by the people, it's deployed in a number of ways. So just to kind of ground this one more time, and what is the purpose of anti-left propaganda? That was our theme for today. Like, what is anti-left propaganda? Like we've just seen, what is its purpose? So first is obviously preventing solidarity, particularly looking at the example of the Animal Farm film. That explicit motive was preventing, the acceptance and the promotion of, communist left-leaning ideas, and to instill this idea that the rest of the people who don't actually believe in communism and who believe in the way of capitalism and Western ideals, fight back and squash out those beliefs. So it's preventing people, who are similarly dealing with systems of harm and systems of oppression from relating to each other and building ideas together and realizing that there are other ways possible. Their solidarity prevention is key there. It's also obviously in many ways to boost this militarist and imperial narrative, boosting the idea that war is ever necessary, it's ever a necessary evil. That's something that the American people and that the people of the world have to buy into. The government needs its people and its citizens to buy into the fact that it's necessity. That's how Congress continues to use US tax dollars to fund the military machine. The people must buy into it as well, and so they need to boost that narrative. And finally, obscuring the motives of what's actually often happening in world events. Oftentimes money, oil, and simple anti-left sentiment and white supremacist sentiment are what's behind a lot of war and aggression that we see in the world. But instead, that's not the image. Again, that wants to be projected back to the people of the nation. So obscuring those motives and preventing, a real peek into what's happening in US interventions abroad is typically a key aspect of propaganda or a key motivation. So when we're critically thinking and consuming, the articles that we read and the, the late night sets that we view, making sure we recognize what propaganda shows up and what exactly it is that it's trying to do. So I want to pause here again. I'm talking a lot. I hope folks are taking in all this information, and ask folks. I'll, answer myself first and open it up to you, Saren. What are your favorite go-to sources for ethical news media? So, not even my own answer. I kind of polled some of my friends, and a lot of the answers I got back were places like Vox and Politico. A lot of folks say the New York Times is where I get all my headlines, and that's about it. Other folks prefer their regional news, so they, their local news station, and don't really pay much attention to national news. And then other folks, say they use the Apple News app, and whatever pops up, whatever gets promoted is where I typically get my news from. So I thought that was an interesting range of answers. I'd love to hear, Saren, where you typically get your news from.
Absolutely. So I'd like to preface this with, I think it's important to consume all kinds of news media because I think it's important to hear what's being said on all sides of the picture. My dad is a Black Republican, and so you can betcha I've watched Fox more than once, but not because it's an ethical sense of news media, but because it's important to understand who benefits from what headline, right? One of the questions that I always like to ask myself whenever I'm reading any news media is, who benefits from me believing this? And am I okay with that? What does that have to say with my historical knowledge around who benefits, right? And so to just answer the question, I like to use Democracy Now. I really love Breaking Points, which is more of a like non-mainstream YouTube-based left form of ethical news media or ethical news. I love to occasionally watch the Young Turks. I do listen to NPR, but I listen to NPR knowing that I have an ear that is willing to call them out whenever they're perpetuating a particular ideology or a particular category of people. So, really, even with any ethical news media, it's important to have that ability to discern who is benefiting from this and how does this engage with my greater historical understanding of positions of power, because that's what this reporting is ultimately helping us do, is decide how we feel about information that involves major positionalities and systems that hold power in our lives, whether that is the military, whether that is a local business or a major corporation, whether that is the Supreme Court. When you're reading news about, all of the institutions that are participating in our society, um, it's important to have that grounding, regardless of who is perpetuating or telling the news.
Absolutely. I think those are great reminders that when consuming media, it's about every single piece of media you consume, consuming it critically, not just picking a news source and then accepting everything that comes from that source, because that, will often lead into you accepting bias and assumptions that you don't even realize. So great reminder that, with each time that you're coming across assumptions, things that are posed as fact, that you're taking a moment and pausing and reflecting on what you know, and letting yourself take a gauge of accuracy. And again, like Sarah said, what is this trying to, who is this benefiting if I believe this? So to, lean more into this idea of why your news media consumption and who you consume your media from matters, I wanted to show this media bias chart. So which is just, Sarah mentioned last time we did this, slightly outdated in many ways in terms of the perception of each of these news media websites, but a really great example of the general leaning of many news sites that folks use. And most of the popular ones on here, and we kind of make our assumptions about what we will see when we see a lot of these. But it's a question I want to bounce back out is, why does it matter who owns the news, and how does that ownership affect the news story you read? So I don't think I I don't have the other graphic that I had last time, but there's among many of these popular news sources, both domestically and internationally, there are very, very few owners. So there are 5, I think, or 6 multi-conglomerate news stations that are owned by just a handful of billionaires. And so despite the range of spectrum you see here, there's very few ownership and difference in who is actually paying for and promoting the media and the news that we're consuming from these sources. So just throwing that question out there for folks to reflect on, why does it matter who owns the news, and how might that make a difference in what we consume? So we want to help here with a little bit of information that's probably old to some folks and maybe a refresher for other folks, or maybe this is something new, but a helpful categorization of the different types of news we consume. So that's helpful for you to have somewhere to begin from when you're trying to figure out how to be critical with the news media you consume. So, you recognize who owns the media and who's writing the piece. You recognize, how to find propaganda and where to look for it. But, what actually is the news trying to get across? So there's typically 3 categories of news media. The first one, called straight news, typically, is typically the hard facts. Breaking news, the who, what, when, and where of things that are happening. Sometimes they offer a point of view, but it's typically more factual based. Second are features, which are much like straight news, but different in typically style. They're usually longer and use more storytelling devices, sometimes called soft news. Not solely focused on the facts, but also bringing in folks' perspectives. But think of things like profiles of athletes and politicians, or story about an issue that a community is facing. These kinds of stories, they use both fact and storytelling and opinion gathering. Then finally, you have editorial or opinion pieces or columns or all these things that fall into this category that are offering a specific analysis on a current event from a specific person's point of view or politic. So that, these pieces usually develop an argument about an issue and interpret the facts as desired. So again, even though these are the three categories of news and they claim to have a certain level of fact or truth to them, there's still always ways for bias to show up. Examples, things such as this idea of a hard fact. Are things always going to be hard fact? I know that seems like a large assumption, but take names, for example. The names that we call places, especially with the histories of colonization around the world, is the accepted name that we feed all our news media, necessarily what the people of that place regard that place as. So that's a strong example of how even things that are hard facts are still often based on heavy and large assumptions that are important to just interrogate. Another example is like, who gets to tell their opinion? Who gets the columns and the editorial pieces and gets to have letters to the editor posted in our news media sources? Are they hearing from everybody, or is this news media source always going to give me an opinion from a particular perspective, from one particular perspective? Who gets that platform and who is it granted to? So something always to think about here and good questions to ask yourself are, how might imperialism and very Western-centric thinking or other isms, of the sort show up in each of these types of media, whether it's straight news, feature, or editorial or opinion piece. So we're gonna quickly take another pause from me chatting and watch a video. I had a couple examples. I think we're gonna watch one of them as a chance to practice a lot of what we've been talking about. So we've talked about, how to recognize the type of media you're consuming, some things to think about, such as who owns this and what are they trying to tell me or sell me, and what is the propaganda they're using, and how can I kind of recognize when I'm being sold a particular opinion, whether I agree with it or not, but I'm being sold a particular opinion. We want to kind of put that to practice. So we're going to watch a video, and as we watch, I want folks to think about the narrative that is being built in the video, any arguments that are being made, the assumptions that are being made, and any propaganda that's being used. So this is an Army ad that you can just find on YouTube. I kind of use some keywords and search some things, and we're gonna listen to this. Sarah, could you let me know if you can hear this?
What'd you say? I'm sorry.
Were you able to hear the video?
No, you're gonna have to do advanced.
Yeah, I figured you probably could hear.
We also can't see it.
Okay.
This is the story of a soldier who operates your nation's Patriot missile defense systems. It begins in California, with a little girl raised by two moms. Although I had a fairly typical childhood, took ballet, played violin, I also marched for equality. I like to think I've been defending freedom from an early age. When I was 6 years old, one of my moms had an accident that left her paralyzed. Doctors said she might never walk again. But she tapped into my family's pride to get back on her feet, eventually standing at the altar to marry my other mom. With such powerful role models, I finished high school at the top of my class, and then attended UC Davis, where I joined a sorority full of other strong women. But as graduation approached, I began feeling like I'd been handed so much in life, a sorority girl stereotype. Sure, I'd spent my life around inspiring women, but what had I really achieved on my own? One of my sorority sisters was studying abroad in Italy. Another was climbing Mount Everest. I needed my own adventures, my own challenge. And after meeting with an Army recruiter, I found it. A way to prove my inner strength and maybe shatter some stereotypes along the way. I'm U.S. Army Corporal Emma Malone Lord, and I answered my calling.
So yeah, that's a super interesting ad. I've been thinking about it ever since I came across it a couple weeks ago. I think it's a great example for folks to sit with and process all of the things and all of the propaganda tools that it uses and all the things that it is trying to sell. And just recognize again, yeah, what is being used to sell you an idea, what idea is being sold to you, what are you being convinced are correlated to each other, what kind of relationships are you being convinced of? And just, yeah, what is it, thinking and recognizing the source that it's from the US Army and the way that it uses identity and movement language and left and justice language to sell an idea of military entropy. Really think about those connections and why those connections are being made. So from there, again, especially with this video fresh on our mind, you want to think about something such as how do we identify bias and build our own politics? So looking at a video like that, I, saw some things the first time around, and the second time around, I recognized more pieces of bias, and third time around, I recognized some of my own bias and some of the things that I thought and, regard that I had for who served in the military and who was attracted to it and what reasons, for example. So this is another question that we want to leave folks to sit with, which are how do we identify this bias and build our own politic when consuming news media? So from there, I want to pause. I know there's a ton of information, but I really hope folks, were able to keep up and to follow this thread of recognizing places where it's important for us to critically think while we consume our media instead of passively consuming our media, and just be aware of the way that we're surrounded by bias and propaganda, but how it's our own responsibility to recognize and build our own opinion in politics and sense of, especially world news, and don't, blindly accept what we're sold in particular news media sources. So I hope folks got a lot out of that, and please leave questions in the chat if there are anything folks missed. If folks want to link to any of the, media pieces I've used, also let me know. But I want to hand it over to Saren.
Thank you, Jasmine. If you could control the slides for me, that would be great. I do want to take a second and just try and absorb that wonderful piece of propaganda. And by wonderful, I'm being sarcastic. Because there were just so many layers to it. And I agree with you in that the first time I watched it, I picked up on some things. But the second time I watched it, I really picked up on some things, as well as my own internal biases, right? Yeah. And I think just on the question of like, how do we identify bias and build our own politic, you were spot on. And just identifying like, A, who would be benefiting from this, B, what immediate judgments are we having, whether it's internal or like, are they having, what assumptions are they making? The mention of UC Davis, and being able to recognize certain language and the way that it is used in cultural dog whistles, right? And cultural whistling. So thank you for that. If you want to go on to the next slide. All right, so in this last half of the training, we're going to be talking a little bit about how to fact check your fact checkers and what tools we can use to do that. Also, we're going to recognize that one thing might be a fact to one person and another thing might be a fact to another, that every fact has multiple sides. The second thing we're going to be looking at is grassroots news media and how to find it. And third, building communities across borders, or building community across borders. So yeah, let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So I'm going to talk really quickly, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to explain this slide. When looking at how to fact check and or disseminate information from whatever resources you're using, I'm sure we're all familiar with rooters or rudders, however you want to pronounce it. Wonderful, you can use them, they're great. But what I also really encourage people to do is take whatever story, headline, idea, or thought that is being fed to you, and you're like, I wonder if this is true. It says it's true here. It says that this organization, it gives you the fact, right? Let's say you look up if BP is behind that ad around the personal carbon footprint. You go on Reuters, it says, yes, BP is behind that ad about the carbon footprint. But if you would like to know why, or what other ways that BP is participating not only in propaganda, or like what is their motive behind putting out a narrative of individual carbon footprinting, I like to use the dark web. And so I'm going to be explaining how to use the dark web and what it is and how to access it, because I find that it allows us to have access to otherwise censored news media that we usually would not be able to get in the United States on our normal, what's called clear web. So just to reiterate that, so there's no confusion on our wonderful internet, we have what's called the clear web, which is what you access and use every day, whether it's going to Zoom, signing on for a work program, or just shopping online. We use the clear net. And you might have heard through different avenues about the dark net, but I'm going to give you the basic, to the point understanding of what the dark net is. And the dark net is a worldwide web content that, I'm reading my words. Okay. The dark net is basically an overlay of networks that uses the internet but requires specific software configurations or authorization to access, meaning you need a particular type of login or a type of web browser. And we're going to talk about what kind of web browser we're going to be using. But through the dark net or dark web, private computer networks can communicate and conduct business anonymously without divulging identifying information such as a user's location. This is really great when you're wanting to not have news media that's just based off your location. Oftentimes, when you're using the ClearNet, because our GPS and because so much is based off of where we're located, oftentimes your top 3 to 5 pages of search browser or like search engine results are going to be based on your locality and your own algorithms. And in order to access information that isn't otherwise, tiered towards your algorithm of what they think you would like, or what they think you would benefit from, you can utilize the dark net or the dark web. Because it makes anonymous a user's location, it allows excuse me, it allows people to be able to have access to all aspects of information that is on the internet, whether it's censored or uncensored. And so lastly, it just says the dark web forms a small part of the deep web, the part of the web not extended by web search engines. And if you want to go to the next slide, I'm going to show you all how to get on the dark web and how easy it can be to do that safely. So that, say, if you want to look up how to, good example. Say there's another racial riot and you're wanting some accurate news media from folks on the ground. You're seeing that a lot of stuff that's being posted on your social media, whether that's TikTok or it is Instagram, is being censored, it's being taken down by the platform, and you're not really able to see what's happening on the ground. What you can do is you can take that content, or you can take that question, you can take that event, and you can type it in the dark web or the dark net. Sorry, that's my cat. And you can go to these particular organizations and accounts to look up basically on the ground uncensored news. that's happening. And so Tor is the particular search engine or software that you can use to access the darknet. Tor is short for the Onion Router, and it's free and it's an open source software for enabling anonymous communication. And I'm going to show you all an example of Tor when I share my screen here in a second. Jasmine, do you think you could stop screen sharing? Thank you. And 1 second. Just want to make sure I have. There we go. And perfect. So I'm gonna go ahead and close all of these out. This is Tor. It looks just like your average internet browser. You can find it online, you can download it, and if you'd like this specific link, you can reach out to me via my own email at PowerShift, and I'd be happy to send it to you. But basically, this is the all anonymous web browser, and I use a secondary web browser on top of the dark web browser called DuckDuckGo to give me the most uncensored results basically that I could ask for. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in a really great organization / news outlet that I like to use when looking at on the ground, local, and unbiased news media. And this is anarchistnews.org. We create the anarchy we'd like to see in the world. This is only one example. I'm giving this example because I'm guessing if you're on this training, you are probably tapped in or wanting to be tapped in into different movement networks and different acts of radicalism and liberation across the world. And I find that this is a really great organization that has a disseminated and decentralized way that people can put up information about what's happening in their communities. Now, it's important to note that anarchist news can be accessed on the clear web or the dark web, as almost every single website can. It's almost like a dark mirror episode. For every episode for every website that you can access on the clear web, there is a backend version on the dark web. But I want to show you this one in particular because, again, this is a really great example that's shown on our slides of one of the news media outlets that I would recommend for folks. And we're going to just pick a random one. Let's do, there we go. This was done on April 26, 2022 by an anonymous collective called The Collective, basically. And it's talking about anarchists from Belarus and activists who were detained, a particular investigation, along with why they are stated they're being detained and or being persecuted or prosecuted. And it's important to note that though this seems like there would be no reason to censor any of this information, if I were to go on the clear web and go to anarchistnews.org, this might not be one of the articles that I would have access to. And in fact, anarchist.org states that it prefers that folks access it on the dark web so it can have access, so those individuals can have access to all of the news content that they're putting out, and not just the ones that are being allowed through the browser of that particular country. And censorship of that particular country. It's also important to state how this information is being reported on. If you look at the wording, it's very much like fact driven. There's not a lot of bias. There's not a lot of a base claim. It's really just reporting. It even states that they were arrested, charged with participation in particular protests, and anarchist media collective, recognized as extremist information, so on and so forth. So it's not saying whether these guys are good or bad, which it's not what it's there for. It's just telling you the facts and that information. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And Jasmine, if you could now share the slides one more time. That's only one example of how to use the dark web. You can also access Facebook through the dark web, Twitter, even your favorite Reddit accounts. But it's important to know that Tor, short for the Onion Router, is owned by the United States Navy, and it was created by the Navy. And it can always be like, why would they create an access point to an entirely untraceable form of communication on the internet, right? Like, what is the point of that? This is a wonderful example of asking, who does it benefit? Who doesn't benefit for there to be a place for crime to be done, whether that's selling drugs, whether that's information, you name it, because it's the dark web. A lot of things happen on the dark web, whether, without laws. But who benefits from allowing there to be consistent communication that way? Um, and I think the answer to that is not a short one, but it does ultimately go to the military and policing industry. There has to be avenues of which Black markets can exist. And this was an avenue of which a Black market could exist on a new platform like the internet after so much censorship and so much regulation happened in the late 90s and early 2000s. So, again, a couple of the orgs and accounts that I wanted to show was anarchistnews.org. That's what we went to. Anarchistfederation.net source list. And that gives you a really, really long list of other news media outlets that connect you to different global perspectives and local news, grassroots news. It's going down.org. You might have heard of it. Submedia, I really love for Canada. And then YouTube/Breaking Points. I think they do a wonderful example of using video newscasting on YouTube as a way to get out non-mainstream media content and different perspectives that maybe major conglomerates such as CNN or MSNBC or Fox News wouldn't allow those perspectives because it doesn't benefit the angle of which they're trying to hold. If you want to go to the next one. Now I want to transition to, how do we take all of that information that we're learning about overseas, access to overseas grassroots news, right, through different anarchist organizations and or decentralized news media stations that I just introduced you to, but what are some good ways to take that information and to continue to build community across borders? You're learning about what's happening in Belarus, you're learning about what's happening in France, you're learning about what's happening in Canada and Mexico from a grassroots perspective, and how do you take that information and continue to grow solidarity within it? And so I don't have an answer in that because there's a lot of answers that can be given, but I do have a couple tips as someone who's organized on binational borders, whether that's Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, or El Paso, Texas, which is where I'm from. I have a little bit of experience. That is my cat, I apologize. I have a little bit of experience of being able to build community across national borders. And so aside from just learning and looking at and researching what's happening in those communities, I really recommend focusing on either any major metropolitan town or city in which the region that you are wanting to either get involved in or learn more about. B, looking at border towns. This is an entire list of border towns all over the United States. So it looks like Tijuana, California, San Diego. You can see Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, Niagara Falls and both Niagara Falls in Ontario and in New York, and then Laredo in Mexico and also in Texas. Because one thing that's important to note, all of the borders that we are identifying are man-made. Nature never had any borders. And so these borders are there specifically to keep people divided, whether that's community, whether that's information, whether that's resistance. And it's a border that is there to show control and to show state value. And so I recommend that when you're educating yourself around what's happening in these different communities, rule number one, make sure you sit down and you always listen, right? If you're not from the community, you don't need to be contributing in its ear. And number two, using the tools that you have, whether that is your social media, or that is the dark web, or that is a savings account, or that is a trust fund, but looking at what resources and what ways that you can contribute into supporting the cause, the individuals, or the community that you're wanting to build relationships with. If you want to go to the next one, Jasmine. Here are a couple more border communities. As you can see, Reynosas, McAllen, Juneau, Alaska, Del Rio. One more, Jasmine. Okay, go back. I'm sorry. I thought I had 3, but I only had 2. And I think lastly, looking at particular tools online that help bridge that gap between certain communities and certain struggles. I think one of the best pieces of advice that I heard from someone, as someone who was originally, moving to the border for college, but wasn't raised there, though was from the larger area of Texas, is that when entering a new community, it's not about finding the differences between you, but finding the similarities in struggle. And so identifying whether you share a class struggle, whether you share a racial disposition, whether you share any avenues or intersections around struggle that can create and form types of community bonds, trusts, and relationships, because that's really what's going to be the root of you feeling connected and or being able to build community across these borders and across different places. And then lastly, just using tools on the internet, such as, there's a couple of forums, whether that's Reddit, whether that's Quora, whether that is, dare I say, 4chan and 8chan. There are lots of ways that you can reach folks outside of the algorithm and the location of which your cell phone and laptop like to determine your participation in. If you want to go to the next one, Jasmine. So some things to kind of leave us with. Remember nuance. There's not always one correct left analysis of the news. It's important to have a nuanced perspective and to have discerning eyes around who it benefits and who would benefit from you believing it. And if you have the ability to make sure that you are getting so many different perspectives, whether that's through the use of the dark web or the use of the clear web. Again, I apologize for my cat. Secondly, critical thinking and fact checking is key. We just talked about that around the dark web. And third, know who's talking. The narrative, the agenda, and the ownership of the source matters. Jasmine, would you like to take it from there?
Yeah, awesome. I think you closed this out perfectly. So I thank folks for coming tonight. We hope you learned a lot. Another reminder that this webinar will be recorded and posted on PSN's website under the resource bank tab. And if folks found this informative, if folks would like something that's more of a deep dive, for example, if folks are looking for more of a specific perspective or have other ideas for webinars they'd like to see in the future, please let us know. You can message us or email us. There will also be a post-program survey coming up soon. So I want to thank folks again for being here. On the screen, we just linked a couple of folks that we're in community with that are great organizations and resources for additional analysis, fact checking, follow the money reporting, and other thoughts on ethical journalism. So those are there if folks are interested. I can send links if anyone would like. But yeah, thanks folks for coming. Please have a great night and see you at more of our programming coming later this summer.